Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on Medicaid Personal Care Assistant or PCA Services Part 1. This webinar will focus on explaining what PCA services are, eligibility criteria for PCA services, and how Medicaid beneficiaries can access these services. We will be presenting a second part of the series on PCA services that focuses on appealing adverse actions like denials and terminations in a separate webinar next week on Friday, January 23rd at 2 p.m. The law regarding PCA services is slightly different for adults than for children or youth under 21, and we will highlight several issues particular to children and youth throughout the webinar. Next slide. My name is Gwen Orlowski, and I will be presenting today along with Bren Pramanik, our legal director, who will be monitoring the chat and helping with Q&A. Next slide, please. Disability Rights New Jersey is a nonprofit. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with a cursor. Sorry, there we go. Is a private nonprofit organization. We're designated under federal law as the state's protection and advocacy agency for individuals with disabilities. Next slide, please. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Our presentation is recorded today, and both the slides and the recording will be shared with all attendees afterwards, and they will be available on our website. Your audio and video are muted, but you can use the chat feature to submit questions or comments at any time. We left time at the end for Q&A using questions typed into the chat during the webinar. And if you need subtitles, you can turn them on by clicking More and selecting Show Subtitles. And if you have any accessibility concerns during the webinar, please put them in the chat. We have Bren and we have Denise from our office also there to troubleshoot any problems. Next slide. A quick note that the information we're providing today is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. It does not create an attorney-client relationship. The next slide, please. Here are today's learning objectives. We're going to review some Medicaid PCA basics. We're going to talk about PCA eligibility and services under the New Jersey regulations. We're going to discuss how a person can access PCA services, and we're going to focus on the PCA assessment tool, and we're going to touch at the very end on the Personal Preference Program, or PPP. A quick note on this. This area of Medicaid law is very heavy with acronyms, and we're going to do our very best to say the entire phrase each time along with the acronym. The exception to that general rule is we will use PCA in place of personal care assistant. Next slide. We're going to begin by making sure we have a shared understanding of how personal care assistant services fit into the New Jersey Medicaid program, including a very high-level recap of Medicaid basics. Next slide, please. New Jersey's Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program are co-branded as NJ Family Care. There are many eligibility pathways into Medicaid with different financial criteria, including eligibility through the Affordable Care Act expansion or MAGI program, the traditional age, blind, and disabled or ABD program, including workability, and through waivers like Managed Long-Term Services and Supports, or MLTSS, or the DD Supports Program, or the Community Care Program. You can find more information about adult eligibility pathways in Disability Rights webinar cited in this slide. The New Jersey Medicaid Agency, State Medicaid Agency, is the Division of Medical Assistance and Health Services, or DMAS, in the Department of Human Services, and they have the ultimate responsibility to ensure that the program operates in accordance with the Federal Medicaid Act. This webinar is about a service, PCA service, and so I want to focus on that for a second. Under the Federal Medicaid Act, states must include mandatory services. An example of that would be inpatient hospital visits, and may include optional services in something called the Medicaid state plan. Sometimes you hear the state plan referred to as Plan A. Everyone who's on full scope Medicaid has access to every service in the state plan, subject to that service being medically necessary, which we'll talk more about in the presentation. In addition, states can provide Medicaid eligibility and additional services through something called waivers, legal agreements between the state and the federal government that waive some of the requirements of the Medicaid Act. For example, providing services in people's homes rather than in institutions like nursing homes. New Jersey has what's called an 1115 waiver titled the New Jersey Family Care Comprehensive Demonstration. For the purposes of this webinar, it is important to know that personal care assistance, or we're still on the same slide, thanks. Personal care assistance, or PCA, is an optional service that New Jersey included in the state plan. It is not a waiver service. This means that everyone on Medicaid has access to PCA services. You do not need to be on a waiver. I have a couple of other notes on this slide related to children and people on the DDD waivers. For children, PCA is available to eligible children on all Medicaid programs. A special federal Medicaid law applies to children and youth under the age of 21 called Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnostic and Treatment, or EPSDT. And under EPSDT, children are entitled to receive all medically necessary treatment to correct or ameliorate the condition, even if an optional service is not in the state plan. A quick note also about DDD waivers. In addition to PCA services, individuals on the DD supports can get a waiver service called community-based supports, and people on community care program can get a waiver service called individual supports. And it's important to know that these waiver services are different than PCA. And if we have time, we'll come back to this in the Q&A section. Next slide, please. States get to choose, with the permission of the Federal Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, the delivery system used to provide Medicaid services to beneficiaries. Traditionally, Medicaid services were delivered through what was called fee-for-service, and this means that the state pays the provider directly. There's no middleman private insurance. New Jersey still delivers DDD waiver services through a fee-for-service model. States can also use waivers to deliver Medicaid services through a managed care model, where through a contract, the state pays a third-party insurance company a capitated rate for each member, and the insurance company, called the Managed Care Organization, or MCO, provides the service, frequently subject to prior authorization and utilization management strategies, which we'll talk about more later in the webinar series. New Jersey has been delivering most Medicaid services through managed care for decades, and that continues in the 1115 waiver. Today, nearly all, but not all, services are delivered to Medicaid beneficiaries through one of 5 MCOs. Their names and telephone numbers are on the slide, and there's a quick practice tip there to remind you that when you talk to your MCO, you engage in a lot of documentation in case that's needed in the future. Next slide. PCA services are delivered to Medicaid beneficiaries through their managed care organizations. Each managed care organization signs a contract with the state, which, among other things, set forth the rules and policies governing the delivery of services like PCA in accordance with the regulations. And this includes terms related to medical necessity, utilization management, prior authorization. A quick historical note, prior to 2011, PCA services were carved out of managed care and delivered through fee-for-service. And even today, there's a mechanism for new Medicaid beneficiaries to get PCA through fee-for-service prior to enrollment in an MCO, which can take about a month. Medicaid beneficiaries who are eligible for PCA services can choose to receive their services through a provider agency, like a home health agency, or through self-direction called the Personal Preference Program, or PPP. And at the end of this presentation, we have a few highlight slides about the PPP program, although a more in-depth discussion is beyond the scope of this presentation. Next slide. Personal care assistant eligibility and services. These services are primarily governed by New Jersey regulations found at Title 10, Chapter 60, Subchapter 3, though other laws and policies come into play, including the state plan, contracts between the MCO and the state Medicaid agency, and sub-regulatory policies. In the next few slides, we're going to focus on the eligibility criteria and services offered under the New Jersey regulations. Next slide. This next slide is dense. Hang with me. So, the regulations define PCA services as health-related tasks associated with queuing, supervision, and/or the completion of activities of daily living, frequently called ADLs, as well as instrumental activities of daily living, IADLs, related tasks performed by a qualified individual in the beneficiary's home, place of employment, post-secondary educational or training program, under the supervision of a registered professional nurse, certified as medically necessary, and in accordance with the beneficiary's written plan of care. That's a lot. The purpose of PCA services is to accommodate long-term chronic or maintenance health care as opposed to short-term skilled care required for some acute illnesses. New Jersey actually has a different service called Home Health Agency Skilled Services to meet those needs. Secondly, the definition says that PCA services must be performed by a qualified individual, like a certified personal care assistant through a qualified provider agency. However, I've already mentioned New Jersey does allow for self-directed PCA through the Personal Preference Program, and we have a couple of slides dedicated to that later in the presentation. Thirdly, the services must be performed in a setting where personal care is not part of the setting's existing service package. For example, PCA services can be provided in a private home, a rooming home, most boarding homes, some DDD group homes, assuming that personal care is not part of the care package, or temporary emergency housing arrangements like a hotel or shelter. PCA services cannot be provided in an assisted living residence because they provide personal care as part of their service package. It's also important to note that PCA services are generally under the written plan of care and supervision of a registered nurse, but again, this works a little differently with the PPP program. Key to the definition of PCA services, as well as to the eligibility criteria and scope of services we're going to be discussing in the next couple of slides, are the definitions of activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living. ADLs are activities related to self-care performed either independently or with supervision or assistance, and ADLs include dressing, bathing, eating, grooming, ambulation, transfer, toileting, and mobility. IADLs are defined to mean those non-hands-on activities or services that are essential for health and comfort and include housekeeping, food preparation, laundry, and shopping. A quick important note here, the regulatory definitions can be a little bit confusing because they imply that all ADLs require hands-on assistance, while IADLs are non-hands-on assistance. But rest assured, Medicaid beneficiaries with cognitive impairments can be eligible for and receive ADL assistance if they need supervision or queuing too, not just hands-on assistance. So it may be better to think of ADLs as basic self-care tasks, while IADLs are more complicated skills needed for independent community living. Next slide, please. So this is a really important slide. It explains the criteria a Medicaid beneficiary must meet in order to qualify for PCA services at all. This slide is not about how an MCO determines the number of PCA hours. We're going to cover that in a few slides. The eligibility criteria require that PCA services be medically necessary under one of two prongs. First, the Medicaid beneficiary must need moderate or greater hands-on assistance with at least one activity of daily living. In the regulations, moderate assistance is defined as weight-bearing support or hand-over-hand assistance in which the beneficiary is involved with physically performing less than 50% of the tasks on their own. Or the beneficiary must need minimal assistance in 3 or greater ADLs, one of which must require hands-on assistance. And the definition for minimal assistance, which is a bit unclear, is non-weight-bearing support with minimal physical assistance from a caregiver when the beneficiary needs physical help in guided maneuvering of limbs or other non-weight-bearing assistance, such as getting in and out of the tub, dressing, or assistance in washing difficult to reach places. And I really need to note here that the second prong clearly allows for eligibility of someone who needs cueing or supervision because of a cognitive impairment in 2 ADLs. And the reason I say that is because under this prong, hands-on assistance is only required in 1 ADL, and because the definition of PCA services includes cueing and supervision, which does not necessarily involve hands-on support. We also will see in a moment that the PCA assessment tool measures the need for supervision and cueing um, as well as minimal assistance. And I have to give a little note here. If you have an intellectual or developmental disability or a cognitive impairment and you are denied or terminated from PCA services because the managed care organization determines that you do not need hands-on assistance in any ADL, please call us at Disability Rights New Jersey. While the eligibility criteria does require hands-on assistance in at least one ADL, we've seen beneficiaries denied or terminated when they meet that second prong, and the MCO was not accounting for the need for cueing or supervision combined with IDD or a cognitive impairment. And I have a second important note here about children and youth under 21. New Jersey does not have a separate PCA regulation or eligibility criteria for individuals under 21. As with all Medicaid services for children from birth through 21, the federal EPSDT standard applies. I already talked about that. Disability Rights New Jersey is not aware of any regulations that establishes different eligibility standards for children and youth. And at the same time, the PCA assessment tool, which we're going to talk about in a couple of slides, itself imposes functional limits on eligibility by tying ADLs, IADLs, and cognitive supervision to age-based expectations. The tool repeatedly conditions eligibility on minimum ages for specific tasks. For example, dressing over 5, bathing over 6, and IADLs largely limited to individuals over 18. And it instructs assessors to record 0 minutes where parents or guardians are deemed responsible based upon, quote, standard developmental milestones. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the tool. Next slide. The specific services covered by PCA are listed in the regulation, and you can read them here. These services can be different covered services than under the PPP program, as well as covered services under the 2 services I mentioned for the DD waivers. And it's easy to get this confused because they feel very similar, but it's really important to keep them distinct when advocating for PCA services. Next slide. Here are the covered IADL services, which you can all read. In a moment, we're going to discuss the assessment process for the number of hours of PCA services, but it's important to note that the regulations make clear that assistants with IADLs only are not permitted as a standalone PCA service. One must accept ADL as well as IADL services. So, for example, a beneficiary cannot agree to receive PCA services for, quote, just shopping and cleaning. This is not sufficient. It would be sufficient to agree to PCA services for shopping, cleaning, and assistance with transfer, like from the bed to a walker or a wheelchair. In addition, if the beneficiary lives with a legally responsible relative, typically a parent, that relative is expected to provide IADL services that benefit the household as a whole. So, for example, care of a bathroom would not be considered a PCA service for a beneficiary whose household member cleans the shared family bathroom. And we'll also see when coupled with the 18-year-old requirement for IADLs, where that comes into play. Next slide, please. PCA services also includes the health-related activities on this slide, which again, folks can read for themselves. Next slide. Now we're going to turn to the process for a Medicaid beneficiary to access PCA services. PCA services in New Jersey are subject to what's called a prior authorization process, and prior authorization is part of utilization management. This means that the services must be approved by the managed care organization in advance of receiving the services, and this is to ensure medical necessity, but it also allows managed care organizations to control cost. And unfortunately, prior authorization takes time and can delay access to services if needed promptly. Next slide. So for Medicaid beneficiaries who seek access to PCA services, we really recommend that the best first step is to contact their MCO. Many people who need PCA services already have a care manager because they're on MLTSS by way of example, or they have a care or case manager because of their previously identified medical need. And the MCO can guide the beneficiary through the process. Generally, everyone's going to need a prescription from the beneficiary's doctor stating in writing that the PCA services are medically necessary. And if you think you need PCA services, it's not a bad idea to get that prescription from the doctor right away. The prescription should be submitted to the beneficiary's MCO in accordance with their instructions. And just a note, you're usually required to have a new prescription on a yearly basis. The MCO, the Medicaid beneficiary's MCO determines both eligibility and the number of PCA hours per week needed using a state-approved PCA assessment tool. A registered nurse from the MCO completes the in-person assessment at the beneficiary's house using the state-approved tool. And the completed tool is reviewed by the MCO's medical director or the medical director's staff, who finalize the specific number of PCA hours approved. For Medicaid beneficiaries on MLTSS, the MCO MLTSS care manager will incorporate the number of approved PCA hours into the managed long-term services and supports care plan. The PCA services can then be delivered either through a Medicaid provider agency like a home health aide or through the PPP program. And if services are delivered through a provider agency like a home health agency, there will be nurse supervision through the provider agency, and the RN will develop a plan of care. PPP has a slightly different process that I'll touch on later. And I mentioned this before, but I'll note it again. There is a process for fee-for-service for individuals who are awaiting MCO enrollment, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation. And lastly, it's important to note that the regulations limit PCA services to 40 hours a week, but also make clear that additional hours may be approved on a case-by-case basis based on exceptional circumstances. And I will tell you, we see that with some frequency at Disability Rights New Jersey. We see folks who have more than 40. And so, if that's what you need to meet your functional needs, do not hesitate to ask for more than 40. Next slide. We'd like to focus for a moment on the PCA assessment tool because the more familiar Medicaid beneficiaries are with the tool and the process, the better chances that they will get the right results, the number of hours they functionally need to help them live in their own homes as independently as possible. This is a picture of the first 2 pages of the assessment tool. You can link to the actual assessment tool there at the bottom. There's a link, and you can go look at the whole assessment tool. And there are additional resources, some of which we'll mention in this presentation at the other link. So the first thing to know is that the PCA assessment tool is a standardized tool created by the Medicaid agency, DMAS, and it was first used starting on January 1st, 2015. This means that every MCO uses the same PCA assessment tool. And just by way of contrast, that's not necessarily true with private duty nursing assessment tools. It's important to review the assessment tool prior to the evaluation by the nurse. The assessment tool covers general information like primary language spoken by the member and in the home, people in the household, the beneficiary's date of birth, as well as information about the beneficiary's cognitive function and any structural or physical barriers in the residential setting. The tool guides the nurse to review activities of daily living, ambulation, transfer, bathing, feeding, eating, positioning in bed or chair, toileting, grooming, dressing, and instrumental activities of daily living, housekeeping, bed linen change, shopping, meal preparation, laundry. These are the ones we discussed earlier from the regulation. It's intended to help the nurse gain an understanding of the beneficiary's physical and cognitive limitations, the ADL and IADL services required, family and living situations, and the frequency and amount of time needed to perform the services. Because it's conducted face-to-face in somebody's home, it allows the nurse to obtain information from observation of the Medicaid beneficiary directly. For example, watching them do an ADL. And also from talking to the beneficiary, natural supports like family members. The assessment results in a determination of the number of hours of PCA, which again are then reviewed by the medical director, and is signed by the nurse as well as the beneficiary or the authorized representative. And it's important to note here that by signing the beneficiary or the authorized representative, they're only acknowledging participation in the assessment, and their signature does not indicate any agreement with the assessor's determination of hours needed. That would come up. People would always have that ability to appeal through the appeals process, which we're going to be talking about next week. Next slide. The assessment begins by looking at the cognitive decision-making ability for beneficiaries over 6 years old. This is an example of where age comes into the test. Important factors to note about this section of the assessment. Time added where the assessor finds that the beneficiary's cognitive decision-making is impaired is not added to each ADL or IADL. Rather, the tool allows for the assessor to add additional time to the total as a lump sum. This section has no option to filter for individual characteristics, and it's not based on the actual determination of time. It just places the beneficiary's cognitive impairment into one of 4 buckets and adds a set amount of time depending on which bucket the beneficiary falls in. There are 4 possible outcomes to this section. No time added, if the person has no cognitive impairment, 60 minutes a week if the person is minimally impaired, defined as needing cueing in a new or specific situation, 120 hours per week if the person is moderately impaired, defined as needing repeated reminders to initiate, perform, or self-direct activities, and the most amount, 180 minutes per week if the person is severely impaired, defined as never or rarely making decisions or unable to self-direct or initiate any activity. Next slide. The next section of the assessment tool looks at the ADLs. And remember, this assessment assesses both eligibility. This section of the assessment assesses both eligibility. You either need moderate in one or minimal in three, one being hands-on, and the number of hours needed for the ADL task. The ADLs on the tool, which align with the regulations, are ambulation, including pushing a wheelchair, bathing, transferring, for example, from bed to chair, eating or feeding, process of getting the food into the mouth or the digestive system, not meal preparation, positioning, toileting, which includes transfer time for toileting, personal hygiene or grooming, and dressing. Note for children and youth. For each ADL, this slide includes the age guidelines. The age limits in the assessment are a guideline, not a hard line. Where a child below the set age has specific assistant needs which go beyond what a typical child would need in that ADL, that can be taken into consideration for an assessor. I will give an example. A typical 2-year-old needs hands-on assistance to dress, so it's unlikely that a 2-year-old with a disability would be found eligible for PCA based on the need for hands-on assistance with dressing. However, we encourage families to explain to the assessor how the task might vary from that of another age child the same age. So while not likely that a 2-year-old would meet eligibility criteria or receive PCA minutes for dressing, if their clothing or the process for dressing the child differs from other children that age, the assessor should note the difference on the form. Next slide. For each ADL, the nurse has to assess a level of assistance from no assist to total dependence with definitions at each level given on the tool, and they're here in the slide for you to see. The tool includes a level of assistance for supervision. You may recall I mentioned that back when we talked about the eligibility criteria, defined as oversight or cueing. And back when we discussed the definition of minimal assistance, and I said it was a bit fuzzy because it looked like you needed hands-on assistance, we believe that the assessment tool clarifies that supervision or cueing is sufficient in 2 ADLs under that second prong, as long as a person needs minimal hands-on assistance in the 3rd ADL. The PCA tool also includes guidance for time each ADL should take. It's important to note that these are guidance. The nurse conducting the assessment should use open-ended questions like, tell me more, tell me about your morning from the time you wake up through breakfast, because this allows for a more person-centered assessment and for the assessment to capture the actual amount of time it takes to perform an ADL, even if it's more than the guidance. For example, for a full bath, 30 minutes. It might take more than 30 minutes. And where the time assessed is more, that's okay. More time can be put in the tool. However, the nurse has to include a justification of need in the box. The nurse is also supposed to assess based on the average of the 3 most dependent examples in the previous 3 to 5 days. And for bathing, it should be the most dependent in the last 7 days. Next slide. The next section of the PCA assessment tool assesses need for assistance with instrumental activities of daily living, including housekeeping, soiled bed linens, groceries, shopping for groceries and incidentals, meal preparation, and laundry. Remember, the IADLs are not part of the eligibility criteria, so if you only need assistance in IADLs, you are not eligible for PCA. Typically, the need for IADL assistance is only assessed for people 18 and over. The exceptions to this are soiled bed linen changes, which are not considered routine, and meal preparation for youth or child under 18, where special preparation is required. The last section of the tool includes the math, totaling all the minutes scored, and translating that into total PCA hours. The tool again must be signed by the nurse and the beneficiary, though signing only means that they participated, not that they agreed. And a copy of the PCA assessment tool is not provided at the time of the assessment. Next slide. Assuming somebody is approved, the MCO should provide the Medicaid beneficiary with a written notice regarding the initial approval for the PCA services that includes information about why the services were approved, as well as information about the number of hours approved. The details included in the initial approvals are important, and they can be used as a point of comparison in future determinations. Again, especially if there is a reduction later on. Reassessments have to occur every 12 months upon change of condition or at the request of the Medicaid beneficiary. Quick note here, that picture we had a couple slides ago, that's the 2015 version, and it says they have a reassessment is required every 6 months, and it cites the regulation. We double checked that regulation. That regulation now says every 12 months. The other thing I want to warn folks about is frequently when you get the approval, the time is written in, is reflected in units of service, usually 15-minute increments, and it can be a little difficult to understand. So if you can't figure that out, you should call the MCO so you understand. Or if you're using a provider agency, they also receive a prior authorization notice with the unit, again, usually in 15-minute increments, as well as when it expires, and they can help you with that too. The Medicaid beneficiary can then work with the provider agency to schedule the start of services and get them going. Again, this is different for people who go through the self-directed PPP program. We're going to discuss adverse actions in part 2 of this webinar series, but a quick word here. Instead of receiving an approval, a person could receive a notice denying the requested PCA services, finding them ineligible, or stating that the services are not medically necessary, which gave rise to appeal rights. Alternatively, even if a beneficiary receives an initial approval, it can be what's called a limited authorization, which also gives rise to appeal rights. For example, the beneficiary might have a prescription requesting 25 hours a week, but may have received a limited authorization for only 15 hours a week. Again, we're going to discuss the appeal rights that go along with that next week. But for our purposes right now, if a Medicaid beneficiary receives either a denial or a limited authorization, it's crucial that they get a copy of their PCA assessment tool immediately. In fact, anybody can get a copy of it. Not necessarily a bad thing to do. By memo dated May 22nd, 2025, the Medicaid agency provided additional guidance to MCOs related to utilization management. We're going to call it the memo. We're going to talk about it a lot next week. And you can find a copy of that memo in this slide, the link in this slide. In the memo, DMOS instructs that a copy of the completed scored assessment must always be provided by the managed care organization to the beneficiary upon request, which request can be made by phone call to the member services or the member services number or the member's care manager. So it doesn't have to be in writing, telephone call. The assessment must be mailed within 5 calendar days of when the beneficiary makes the request, or if made by someone else, within 5 days of when the managed care organization receives the appropriate authorization of representation form or equivalent documentation. Before I end, a quick note, um, before I end with a couple slides about PPP, a quick note. Back in 2015, DMOS did a webinar for advocates um, that was based on the training that they do for managed care organizations on the PCA assessment tool and how nurses should use it. That webinar is still available through the ARC of New Jersey. And the citation for it isn't, the link isn't on this slide. It's a couple previous slides where it said general information about PCA can be found here. So you can go there and you can listen to the webinar that was presented by Medicaid regarding how nurses should use the tool. Maybe not a bad idea prior to your assessment. Next slide. I have two quick slides about PPP. This webinar is not about the the intricacies of the PPP program. It really is to just give you some context in some places that there's maybe a little bit of difference between PCA and PPP. So, as been stated, the state allows for self-direction through PPP, and under PPP, a Medicaid beneficiary can hire workers like trusted friends or relatives and plan their own services and goods based on individual need. The general eligibility rules for PPP require that the person be Medicaid eligible, that they be approved by their MCO for PCA services for at least 6 months, and that they have the ability to self-direct or have an authorized representative who can act on their behalf. And again, what's important for the purposes of this presentation is that the Medicaid beneficiary's MCO conducts the PCA assessment that determines both eligibility for the services and the number of hours using the tool we discussed, even if you're on PPP. Everything we said here about Part 1 eligibility and calculating the number of hours applies to people in the PPP program. There's also rules about regulations about denial of participation and involuntary disenrollment. This is a little bit different from the appeal rights that go along with managed care organization determinations. So the Medicaid agency retains sole authority in determining the participant's appropriateness for self-direction. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation on appeals. Participants do have a right to administrative review of denial or disenrollment, but the rules are not 100% aligned with the rules that relate to personal care assistance decisions by the managed care organization. And our last slide before we go to questions, next slide. Um, uh, the main way that PPP is different than provider PCA services is that PPP participants receive a budget, which they then use to purchase their services. And that budget is set upon the number of hours approved through the managed care organization assessment tool, just as that we just discussed, multiplied by a defined hourly wage. And the PPP participant can then use that budget to meet their individual needs. For example, by paying a higher hourly wage because they need services at night or on weekends. In addition to services, a PPP participant can use their budget to purchase certain goods related to activities of daily living. However, they cannot use their budget to purchase goods and services not related to activities of daily living. There's a lot of examples of this, but a quick one, you can use your budget to pay for transportation services to assist with ADLs and errands. That's a permissible expense. So it would be something like purchasing a laundry service. But an impermissible expense an example would be costs associated with travel for vacations like airfare or exercise equipment. In addition, because the beneficiary takes on the role of employer, they're required to work with a fiscal intermediary who helps with things like payroll, paying employer taxes, arranging for workers' comp, and more. And I'm sure most of you on this know there's a lot of change around the fiscal intermediary process, both in PPP and through the DDD waiver self-direction. And that is beyond the scope of this presentation, but we include a link to a human services page that gives a lot of information about the changes in fiscal intermediaries. And with that, I think we'll go to the presentation is over and we can go to Q&A. And I'm wondering, Bryn, if it's maybe best to take down the slides. And that will also make it easier for me to see questions in the chat, though I assume you're going to feed me questions.
That's correct. Yeah, I will take down the slides, and I don't believe as of right now there are any outstanding questions in the chat, but certainly if folks do have any questions, they can enter them into the chat.
Did questions get answered? Sorry, I could
Yeah.
not follow the chat while we were.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I will go back then, giving some time to see if there are any questions. I'll go back to one of the points that I was highlighting. And I highlighted this because I get when we talk to clients, I get this a lot. So I feel like there must be, it's complicated and people must sometimes get it confused. Give me a second. I'm just going back to my notes on this. So um, I apologize. Give me one more second. Okay. So earlier in the presentation, I said that PCA services are part of the state plan. So everybody who's on Medicaid, doesn't matter which door you came through, you do not have to be on waiver. You can access PCA services. But then and that includes people on managed long-term services and supports. But then there are other services that you can get through the DD supports program and the community care program, which can include assistance with activities of daily living. So sometimes it can feel a lot like PCA. The answer is you can get both. You can get both PCA services through the managed care company, and you can get those waiver services through either the DD supports or the community care program. But it's important to understand that they're different services and they're coming from different places and they have different rules. So one example would be that the waiver services, again, can include assistance with activities of daily living, but it also can include more. It can include, for example, assistance with community-based activities. And so it's really important when you're trying to knit together the totality of the services you're accessing to create the best possible plan for yourself to be looking at the PCA as well if you're on the DD waiver supports or on the community care program, looking at the services that you can use your budget to purchase there as waiver services and figure out how to best make them work together. Also, sometimes we hear that people are getting cuts to the services that come through their waiver, and that process is different than the process with the MCO. Um, and so there are different mechanisms, and we'll probably highlight that a little bit in part two next week. And yes, Mercedes just said, and I agree, you can't overlap those services. But you can have PCA and the DDD services, and the DDD services can do ADL assistance. It just can't be at the same time, can't overlap. Um, all right. Any last minute questions? I do see somebody asked something about the PASP program. Again, because that is not a Medicaid service, it's outside of the scope of this presentation, but important. And so that will give us an idea for a future webinar to do something that really focuses on the PASP program. So. Um, And I do see that Bren answered this, but the copy of your assessment PCA assessment cannot be denied to you. It could never be denied to you. And we're going to talk more about that next week because we really believe at Disability Rights New Jersey that any adverse notice telling you your benefits are cut, denied, reduced should include a copy of that assessment that the federal law, while it doesn't require it, it requires a detailed explanation, and the only way to really do that might be a copy of the assessment. We haven't prevailed upon the state yet to agree with us on that, but we are happy to see but they understand the need for the assessment, that people who want to review it, make sure it's correct, maybe want to challenge what's been provided, what's been determined under the tool, that they need a copy of that assessment. And under this new May 2025 guidance, it's really quite clear that a copy of the PCA assessment tool has to be provided. That's not the same as the PDN assessment tool, the private duty nursing assessment tool, and that is the subject of a different webinar. So, and we are going to be having, I see this is in the box too, the chat box, that part two, where we're going to be focused on what are called adverse benefit determinations, denials, limited authorizations, reductions. Um, we're going to be focused, terminations. We're going to be focused on that next Friday, January 23rd at 2 p.m. And we're going to go through the process there that involves internal appeals with managed care organizations, fair hearings, and most importantly, how to assure that you have continuation of benefits while that process is going on. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Bren, did I miss anything?
You did not, no.
All right, wonderful. Well, then I'll give people back 6 minutes in their day. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see a lot of you next week. And everybody stay warm. I swear the temperature is going to go down to the bitter, bitter cold this weekend. So bundle up. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.